Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're embarking on a truly fascinating journey through the modern evolution of African philosophical and political thought. We're going to explore how abstract concepts of identity transform into real, tangible actions, basically passing from the shadows of history right into the dawn of a totally new era. Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder what comes after a renaissance? I mean, a renaissance, by definition, is this beautiful rebirth, right? An awakening of ideas and culture. But what happens when that period of philosophical rebirth has to transition into concrete, on-the-ground action? How do you take the high-minded ideals of a renewed identity and actually apply them to the real world? Well, that is the exact pivotal question driving our exploration today. But before we can move forward, we have to look at what's being left behind. Section 1, the illusion of race. Our sources highlight philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, who presents a really brilliant critique of two major paradigms here. He deeply critiques both Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. Appiah argues that Eurocentrism imposed this flawed, monolithic view of Western superiority onto the rest of the world. But he also notes that Afrocentrism emerged as a reactive ideology that does something remarkably similar. It posits a unified, singular African cultural and racial essence. Appiah points out that this relies on a mythical animism, which is a concept that completely erases the immense internal diversity of Africa. We're talking thousands of language groups, distinct histories, and rich variations. He views both of these frameworks as fundamentally flawed because they rely on fixed traits to define entire continents of people. Which brings us to essentialism. Appiah drops a pretty fascinating reality check here. Get this, the genetic variation within purported racial groups actually rivals the variation found across all of humanity. It's a hard scientific fact. So assigning fixed cultural, moral, or intellectual destinies based on something like skin color, it just doesn't align with the empirical evidence. And that leads us straight to this incredibly powerful quote from Appiah. Racial identity is a biological nonsense. Now, instead of clinging to rigid biological categories, Appiah champions what he calls a rooted cosmopolitanism. In this view, identity is wonderfully fluid. He suggests that ethical engagement with the world should start right from your own cultural roots. You should absolutely have pride in your heritage, but you can't insulate those roots from external critique or cross-cultural dialogue. It's really all about honoring your local attachments, while simultaneously recognizing your universal duties to humanity. But on the ground, there was still a profound, urgent historical need to reclaim African agency from colonial narratives. Section 2, the African Renaissance. Let's move to and see how this builds over time. Because the concept of an African Renaissance didn't just appear overnight, it evolved over decades. In the 1960s, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah championed the new African Renaissance, emphasizing that African history must be written from the perspective of African society, not just as some European adventure. Fast forward to the 1990s, and South African President Thabo Mbeki revitalized the African Renaissance as a call to free the continent from the legacy of neocolonialism. And finally, we see the progression into the present day, what contemporary thinkers are calling the Mokoko period. The rhetoric surrounding this African Renaissance era was, frankly, incredibly uplifting. Mbeki's vision was about empowering Africa to help the entire world rediscover the oneness of the human race. The text actually described this as an Afro-optimistic thesis. The goals were grand and sweeping, ending neocolonialism, achieving deep social and economic integration across African states, and fundamentally shifting the paradigm of how Africa interacts with the global village. However, this era ended up facing a very sharp philosophical critique from within. Think about it. The very word Renaissance is inherently European. It ties right back to the European rebirth of arts and sciences after the Middle Ages. So critics argued that by using this specific term, Africa was maintaining a northbound gaze. It was this unintentional way of keeping the standard of progress fixed on the northern hemisphere. The literature argues that if Africa remains in its Renaissance, it kind of allows the North to claim they've already moved past that into the Age of Reason, which they use to justify continued universal leadership. This tension really highlighted the need for a totally new framework, one drawn explicitly from the African experience. And that brings us to Section 3, the Mokoko period dawns. We are moving beyond the optimistic rhetoric into a radical shift demanding immediate action. So what exactly is Mokoko? Well, it's the Sotho word for a rooster, or a cock. And just like that 5 a.m. alarm clock you absolutely cannot ignore, the early morning crow of the rooster is a deeply powerful visual metaphor here. It literally signals the passage from darkness to light. It acts as a warning, the fulfillment of a prophecy, and, essentially, an invitation for everyone to wake up, rise to the occasion, and actively participate in the new day. It represents a bold African renewal, where the African experience is finally granted absolute primacy. The sources actually point to a highly specific catalyst for this era, an event known as the Mokoko Affair at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. According to the text, this event spread like a conflagration. It served as the real, undeniable crow of the Mokoko. This wasn't just some localized dispute within an academic institution. Our sources frame it as a fundamental reaffirmation of dignity. It asserted that the African experience must take the lead when interpreting Africa's politics, history, and philosophy.
Which leads us seamlessly into Section 4, Justice and Restitution. How do the abstract ideals of liberation transform into enforceable requirements in the real world?
To truly understand this shift, the texts introduce another incredibly potent symbol, the hungwe, or the sacred Zimbabwe bird. In Shona culture, this bird is an indispensable point of contact with ancestral gods, the very gods who are believed to have granted the land from time immemorial. The hungwe serves as a massive metaphor for the memory of conquest. It symbolizes the historical loss of land and sovereignty through injustices that the text notes were based on lawlessness and a complete lack of morality during colonization. The text actually describes the metaphorical song of this bird with a really striking quote: "The gods shall never sleep until the return of the land to original and rightful owners." This powerful imagery represents a totally uncompromising demand to remedy historical injustice. The literature positions this not merely as a modern political debate, but as an active requirement driven by deep ancestral memory. The source material uses this imagery to explain the fervent drive for the return of land and unmodified sovereignty in nations like Zimbabwe, framing the whole thing as an essential assertion of dignity through historical justice. So the crucial point is that the Mokoko period is defined entirely by action. Historical justice isn't just a nice idea here. Our sources explain that it's framed as an active duty. This means tangible restitution and reparations. It means the physical return of the land. It demands a reversion to unencumbered sovereignty, entirely free from neocolonial ties. And finally, it positions African memory not just as folklore, but as a rigorous, valid critique of Eurocentric history. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive, seismic shift we've been exploring today. We move from the beautiful ideals and Afro-optimistic rhetoric of the African Renaissance directly into the Mokoko period, a demanding era of action, restitution, and centering the African experience. It deliberately abandons that northbound gaze and demands that historical wrongs be actively righted in the present day. Which leaves us with a massive, provocative question to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. How does global history change when historical justice moves from being just a theoretical debate to an active, non-negotiable requirement? When the rooster crows and a new day finally dawns, the rest of the world has to adjust to the light. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Mokoko period and the evolution of African thought. Keep learning, keep questioning the paradigms around you, and I will see you in the next explainer.